Somewhere in the American South right now, there are two families who have never met, worship at different churches, and live on opposite sides of town. But if you laid their family trees side by side on a table, they would turn out to be the same tree, the same great-great-great-grandfather, the same plantation, the same land, and in some cases, the same house still standing today. One branch has spent 200 years hearing stories about a respected planter and his devoted wife. The other has spent 200 years hearing almost nothing at all, because the woman at the root of their line was never allowed to appear in the records as anything other than property. DNA does not care which side of that story you were raised on. It does not check whose name appears on the deed, which family kept the china, or which family was allowed to vote. It simply remains there, quietly, inside millions of Americans, waiting for a testing kit and a database match to bring two branches of the same family back into contact for the first time in 2 centuries. This is not a new phenomenon invented by 23andMe. It is one of the oldest and most carefully hidden realities in American family history, and over the past 20 years, DNA science has begun pulling it into the light whether anyone was ready for it or not. Today, we are going to talk honestly about what that history looked like, how it became hidden in the first place, what genetic evidence has confirmed in specific, well-documented cases, and what it could mean if your own family tree, black or white, has roots running through the plantation South. I want to say clearly at the beginning that this is a serious subject, and it deserves to be treated that way. This is not a party trick for a dramatic DNA reveal video. It is the story of what happens when a legal and social system is designed specifically to deny that certain relationships and certain children ever existed on paper, and what happens 200 years later when biology quietly overrules the paperwork anyway. Let's begin with why the paper trail looks the way it does, because you cannot understand the DNA evidence without first understanding the records it is correcting. For roughly 2.5 centuries, enslaved people in the American South were treated by law as property rather than family members, regardless of what relationships actually existed inside a household. Enslavers routinely fathered children with enslaved women, sometimes through direct coercion and sometimes through relationships, formed under conditions where genuine consent was impossible because of the total imbalance of power. The law was deliberately structured to erase any resulting kinship from the official record. Under the legal doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, a child's status followed the mother. That meant every child born to an enslaved woman was born enslaved, regardless of the father's identity, even when the father was the woman's own enslaver. This was not an accidental result of poor record-keeping. It was the entire point of the system. A wealthy planter could father children with an enslaved woman on his property, and those children could legally be enslaved by their own biological father. They could be sold by him or willed to his recognized white children as property, with no legal mechanism requiring him to acknowledge the biological relationship at all. Meanwhile, the planter's recognized white family line received the full documentary treatment history usually preserves: wills, land deeds, portraits, family Bibles, published genealogies, and sometimes entire county histories written specifically to celebrate their role in building the region. The enslaved line, often consisting of the same man's biological children, might receive nothing more than a bill of sale. Enslaved people were frequently listed in estate records only by first name, age, and monetary value. Sometimes they were not named at all, but simply counted as numbers alongside livestock, furniture, and farming equipment. When emancipation came in 1865, formerly enslaved people often had to establish surnames for themselves for the first time. Some adopted the surname of a former enslaver. Others deliberately chose an entirely different name, specifically to create distance between themselves and the family that had denied their humanity for generations. This is why professional and amateur genealogists spent more than a century confronting what researchers often call the brick wall of 1870. The 1870 census was the first federal census after emancipation, in which formerly enslaved people appeared as full individuals with surnames, rather than as anonymous entries in a slaveholder's inventory. Before that date, the paper trail for the overwhelming majority of African American families simply goes dark, not because those ancestors did not exist, but because the system never intended to record them as people with names, parents, children, and relationships worth preserving. DNA changes that equation entirely, because DNA was never part of the legal fiction. It does not check whether a relationship was written down in a courthouse record. It simply remains in your cells, whether a clerk in 1840 wanted to acknowledge that relationship or not. Now let's talk about how the actual science works, because understanding the method matters if you want to understand why these connections are appearing today, in a way that simply was not possible 20 years ago. The most well-known confirmed case in all of American history is Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. For nearly 2 centuries, the relationship between the third president and an enslaved woman he held in bondage at Monticello was treated by mainstream historians as an unproven and disreputable rumor, despite the fact that formerly enslaved members of the Hemings family and their own descendants had insisted for generations that it was true. In 1998, a team led by geneticist Eugene Foster published DNA results in the journal Nature comparing the Y chromosome, which passes essentially unchanged from father to son down the male line, of male line descendants of Jefferson's paternal uncle against male line descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally Hemings' youngest son. The Y chromosome match was a direct hit. Combined with the extensive documentary and circumstantial evidence historians had already assembled, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello formally concluded that Jefferson was, in all likelihood, the father of some or all of Sally Hemings' children. It's worth being precise about what the Y DNA test itself actually proved. It confirmed that a Jefferson male fathered Eston Hemings, meaning the broader Jefferson male line formed the pool of possible candidates, rather than identifying Thomas Jefferson specifically to the exclusion of every other Jefferson man. But when combined with a documentary record showing Jefferson was consistently present at Monticello 9 months before each of Sally Hemings' children was born, the historical case is considered settled by the overwhelming majority of professional historians today. This case matters far beyond Jefferson himself, because it accomplished two important things. It confirmed, at the highest possible level of American historical prestige, that oral history passed down inside black families for generations, and dismissed for 2 centuries by white historians as unreliable folklore, was actually accurate. And it demonstrated, in an extremely public way, exactly how Y chromosome testing and broader genetic genealogy could be used to examine these specific, long-suppressed family claims. There's a second major documented case worth knowing, because it shows that this pattern didn't end with the colonial or antebellum era. It continued well into living memory. In 2003, shortly after the death of longtime South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond, a woman named Essie Mae Washington Williams publicly confirmed what her own family had known privately for decades, that she was Thurmond's daughter. She was born in 1925 to Carrie Butler, a black woman who worked as a maid in the Thurmond family household when she was a teenager, and Thurmond was in his early 20s. Thurmond, who spent much of his political career as a prominent segregationist, had privately supported his daughter financially for years while never publicly acknowledging her. The Thurmond family formally confirmed their relationship after Washington Williams came forward. This case is particularly important to this discussion because it happened within living memory, was fully documented and publicly confirmed by both families, and demonstrates that these hidden family connections aren't some safely distant colonial era phenomenon. They run straight through the 20th century as well. Now let's talk about how modern DNA testing surfaces cases like this, even when nobody comes forward publicly in the way Washington Williams did. When a black American and a white American with deep roots in the same county or historical plantation both take a consumer DNA test and upload their results to a shared database, they may appear as DNA matches. They may share a measurable and specific amount of genetic material consistent with a particular degree of relationship, such as second cousins, third cousins, or something more distant. Genetic genealogists then work to determine exactly how that relationship fits together, often using a method called triangulation. This means comparing shared DNA segments across multiple known relatives on both sides to identify the specific ancestor from whom that shared genetic material was inherited. In case after case documented publicly by professional genetic genealogists and by researchers connected to projects including Freedmen's Bureau digitization efforts and the University of Virginia's Georgetown Memory Project, those matches trace back to exactly the pattern history would predict. An enslaver and an enslaved woman living on a particular plantation, with descendants now scattered across both the white and black branches of the same family, most of whom had no idea the other branch existed, until a DNA match notification appeared in their inbox. There's another genetic marker worth understanding here as well, the Y chromosome, this time in African American men specifically. Because surnames in America usually pass down the male line, and because many formerly enslaved families took or were given the surname of a white slaveholding family, genetic genealogists have found that a meaningful percentage of African American men carry Y chromosome DNA tracing back to European ancestry. In some cases, that DNA matches specific documented white families carrying the same surname, whose written and oral histories include slaveholding in the same county or region. This does not mean every shared surname reflects this history. Many formerly enslaved families deliberately chose surnames unrelated to their former enslavers, and many white families with common surnames have no documented connection at all. But where the DNA match, historical record, and shared surname all align, the pattern repeatedly matches what the historical record would predict. And it often confirms exactly what oral history inside black families had maintained for generations, only to be dismissed by outside historians for just as long. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reverses something important about how we usually think about supposedly unreliable family legends. For most of the 20th century, when a black family said, "We always knew we were related to the white family who owned the plantation, and we share the same surname for a reason," that story was often treated by professional historians, and frequently by the white family involved, as an uncomfortable and unprovable claim. Sometimes it was dismissed outright. DNA has changed that dynamic considerably. In case after documented case, the oral history turns out to be the more accurate record, while the official documentary record, built specifically to erase the relationship, turns out to be the incomplete one. So what does this actually mean if you're a white American with deep colonial or antebellum Southern roots and you take a DNA test? First, understand what a DNA match actually tells you and what it does not. If you match with an African American person at a level consistent with a fourth or fifth cousin relationship, and both family trees trace back to the same rural county in Virginia, Georgia, Mississippi, or another southern state before 1865, that connection deserves to be taken seriously and researched properly rather than dismissed. It does not automatically prove that one of your direct ancestors enslaved a woman and fathered a child with her. There are other possible explanations for shared ancestry across racial lines in the South, including earlier marriages between free people of color and white families during the colonial period, as discussed in previous videos on this channel. But given the enormous scale of the historical pattern, with millions of enslaved women living under exactly these conditions across 2.5 centuries, it remains one of the most statistically plausible explanations and deserves real investigation rather than an assumption in either direction. Second, understand what that match may mean for the black family on the other side. For many African American genealogists, the brick wall of 1870 has been the most painful and frustrating obstacle in tracing their family history. Beyond that point, entire generations of ancestors may appear only as first names, ages, and monetary values inside an estate inventory. A DNA connection to a documented white family with detailed genealogical records, wills, land deeds, portraits, and letters can suddenly open generations of previously inaccessible family history. It can reveal names, locations, dates, and sometimes even physical descriptions or images of ancestors who otherwise left almost no trace in the official record. This is why organizations such as Coming to the Table, founded specifically to bring together descendants of enslavers and descendants of the people they enslaved, and plantation-based projects such as Monticello's Getting Word Oral History Initiative have become so important. Their purpose is not assigning inherited guilt or blame. It is rebuilding family history that the legal system of slavery was deliberately designed to erase. Third, and this is the part requiring genuine honesty, approach the discovery with humility rather than defensiveness or performative shock. If your family research uncovers a documented connection like this, the appropriate response is not panic, and it is not treating the discovery as a scandalous secret that needs to be buried again. Genealogists and historians working in this area consistently emphasize that any contact with newly discovered relatives should center the perspective and comfort of the descendants of the enslaved ancestor first. They are the people whose family history was taken from them, not the people who need to be convinced that the history itself is real. There is also a broader historical pattern worth understanding, because it explains why so many white Southern families carry these connections without any surviving family knowledge of them. By the eve of the Civil War, historians estimate that roughly 1 in 4 white Southern households enslaved people. Among the larger plantation operations that left behind the most detailed documentary records, including wills, estate inventories, plantation ledgers, and correspondence, that proportion was considerably higher. Given that scale, and the well-documented pattern of enslavers fathering children with enslaved women across the antebellum South, genetic genealogists increasingly argue that these hidden connections were not rare exceptions, limited to famous figures such as Jefferson or Thurmond. They were a widespread but poorly documented feature of Southern family history. DNA testing is only now beginning to reveal them at scale, because enough descendants from both branches of these families have taken tests and uploaded their results to the same databases. It is also important to understand the limits of what DNA testing alone can establish. A shared DNA match can demonstrate that 2 people descend from a common ancestor. It cannot, by itself, reveal the full history of consent, coercion, or the precise nature of the relationship between that ancestor and the woman who bore the child. Historians and descendants researching these connections repeatedly caution against both extremes. One is romanticizing the relationship as a hidden love story that somehow transcended the brutal realities of slavery, which was rarely a defensible interpretation given the total legal, economic, and physical power one person held over the other. The other is flattening every case into an identical narrative without examining the specific documentary circumstances. The real history, case by case, is almost always more particular, more complicated, and more painful than either the romanticized version or the simplified version allows. If you're beginning to suspect that your own family tree may include one of these connections, the research usually starts with the surviving paper trail on the white side of the family. Begin with wills, probate files, and property inventories created before 1865 in the specific county where your ancestors owned land. These records frequently list enslaved individuals by first name and age, and sometimes document relationships between them, particularly mothers and children. Enslaved families were occasionally kept together during estate divisions, though far from always, because keeping a mother with her infant was considered practical rather than humane. Cross-reference those names with Freedmen's Bureau records created between 1865 and 1872. The Bureau's marriage records, labor contracts, school records, and other documents are among the richest surviving sources connecting formerly enslaved people to the plantations and enslaving families that had previously held them. Many of these records have been extensively digitized in recent years, specifically making this kind of cross-referencing more accessible to genealogists researching both branches of these family lines. On the DNA side, if you've already taken a test, examine matches whose family trees trace back to the same county and historical period as your antebellum ancestors, regardless of the racial identity suggested by their profile or family tree. Genetic genealogists specifically recommend against filtering or dismissing matches based on assumptions about race, because doing so can keep the same family connection hidden for yet another generation. If you identify a promising match, genealogical societies and research groups specializing in African American genealogy can often help determine exactly where the two family trees connect. Regional chapters of Coming to the Table may also provide valuable guidance for navigating the research and making that first contact with care and respect. Here is what I believe is the most important thing to understand about all of this. The system of American slavery was deliberately built around two separate acts of erasure happening at the same time. It erased enslaved people's names, marriages, and parentage from the official record, treating human beings as property to be inventoried rather than as families whose relationships deserved to be documented. At the same time, it erased the existence of mixed-race children fathered by enslavers. Those children were legally classified as property, rather than recognized as sons and daughters, ensuring that no inheritance, family name, or public acknowledgement ever had to follow. 200 years later, a cheek swab and a shared database are quietly undoing both forms of erasure at once. They are reconnecting names to people who were denied them and reconnecting fathers to children who were legally denied any recognized father at all. That is not a scandal. It is history slowly correcting itself, one DNA match at a time, whether the families on either side ever expected that correction to happen or not. If your own family research has uncovered a connection like this, or if you've encountered the same brick wall at 1870 faced by so many African American genealogists, I'd genuinely like to hear what you discovered, how you approached it, and where the research is leading you now. This is exactly the kind of hidden American history this channel exists to investigate honestly, without turning real family pain into entertainment for its own sake. If that is the kind of research you want to see more of, subscribe, and let's continue doing this work together, one documented connection at a time.